So my background is as an engineer. So I've spent close to 20 years now, actually, working as an engineer in the construction industry in New York. Actually started back with Mo from day one. He was a mentor of mine early on. And it was really in the last 5 or 6 years that I really became aware of and focused on the issues of affordable housing, because prior to that, it was mostly kind of high-end, fancy buildings. But 5 or 6 years ago, my eyes were really opened to this issue. But I do come at it from a very technical, engineering perspective. That is my expertise. So people who have other perspectives, like Luana, what you were sharing, all of that has to be part of it. And so I really welcome all of those kind of inputs into this discussion and into how we solve this problem. But uh, I'll go ahead and jump into sharing my screen and a bit of the presentation. The way I view this problem is about the fact that our buildings are getting really old, as Mo said. And when you have old buildings, buildings are like people. When they get old, they start having problems. And I really look at the problems that we have in kind of these four main categories. So one is energy efficiency and decarbonization, which is something Mo talked about a lot. Obviously, there's a huge push and awareness now to reduce the carbon emissions of our buildings. We have Local Law 97 in New York City. We want to be net zero by 2050. And obviously, when you have all these old, super inefficient buildings, that's a big problem. And something needs to be done if we're going to hit those 2050 targets. And that's something that's getting a lot of attention right now. But the problems go much deeper than that. Another huge problem, which I don't think gets talked about nearly enough, is the issues of indoor air quality in these buildings. And this has, direct implications on the health and well-being of the people who live in these buildings. The fact is that most of these buildings do not have ventilation. What they have is operable windows. And, when these buildings were built, in the 50s and 60s, maybe people thought that was good enough. But today we know better. When you just open a window, who knows how much fresh air is actually coming in? And when you're in a building, in a dense urban environment next to busy highways, in a super polluted area, you open that window and you're just letting all that pollution right in. It's truly a public health crisis that we have. The Bronx, asthma alley, they call it. It's truly a crisis for the health and the well-being of the people who live in these buildings, that they do not have proper air quality. So that's just another problem here. And then there's affordability. Calling these buildings affordable housing is really an extreme misnomer, because these buildings are anything but affordable. Maybe the rent is somewhat affordable for the people who live there, but that's only because it's heavily subsidized. Because when you get old, crumbling buildings like this, they actually become extremely expensive to operate and to maintain these buildings. Back to the inefficiency, these buildings spend a lot of money just on energy bills because they're so inefficient. But also, when you have these old, crumbling brick facades, the amount of money that they spend inspecting those facades, setting up scaffolding to repair, repoint, do all the work they need to do, it's incredibly expensive. And so you look at NYCHA, I don't know exactly what their budget is, but I think it's something like a $12 billion a year budget that they have. They have a lot of money. The problem is so much of that money is going into just these unaffordable buildings and just to pay the energy bills and just to repair them. And not enough of that money is actually going into actually improving people's lives in these buildings. And then the last point is resiliency. When these buildings were built in the 50s and the 60s, it was a different climate back then. Uh, flood zones are totally different now. We now have, much stronger hurricanes and storms than we did back then. And Mark talked about cooling. Back then, summers weren't as hot, and you could get away without cooling. Cooling was a luxury. If you can afford a window AC unit in your apartment, great, you can get one. But if you can't, you can live without it. But today, that is absolutely unacceptable. Summers are much hotter, and they're only going to continue getting hotter from here. And just like heat is a basic necessity because people will die without proper heating, that's now the case for cooling as well. And so these buildings really need cooling in order to just protect, the life and well-being of the people who live in it. It's not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity. So, Mo used a great statistic
You can use either
that
one
I'll
of them.
just,
That's okay.
yeah.
It's my middle name. So
Right. So this is just a chart to put an image on how old our building stock is. This is going back, to pre-1900s all the way to the last decade, showing all the construction in New York City. And it really shows how old our city is. Uh, Not only that, it shows that our city is more multifamily than anything else. People think about New York, they think about, big fancy office buildings and, uh, fancy things like that. But this city, more than anything else, is old multifamily buildings. And so that's really the area we need to figure out how to solve. So again, echoing most comments, the real question that's facing us is how do we actually modernize the infrastructure of these old buildings? And knocking them down is simply not an option. And I'll explain what I mean by that. You can look at an individual building and look at the retrofit options and come to a conclusion, as Mo said, that maybe it's so expensive to retrofit, maybe economically, maybe it makes sense just to knock it down and build a new one. You can maybe make that economic argument. But really, that's just showing how desperate we are. That's just showing how bad our current retrofit solutions are, that we would actually even consider that. Well, that's really missing the forest for the trees, because we need to think about scale here. I just showed that graph, that chart. We have tens of thousands of these old multifamily buildings. And there is no way our city is going to knock down tens of thousands of old buildings and rebuild them. It's simply impossible. From a cost perspective, from a labor perspective, we don't even have enough labor for our current, construction industry. Forget about, thinking about knocking down all these buildings and building new ones. There is no labor to do that. The amount of waste that would create, the amount of carbon emissions that is involved with building a new building, just extracting the materials, manufacturing the materials, shipping them, building the buildings, the embodied carbon to just rebuild all those buildings would totally shoot all those 2050 goals. It would make it laughable. And then there's obviously tenant displacement. We're going to knock down all these buildings. Where are all these people going to go? So again, when you look at an individual building, maybe you can make an economic argument. But when you look at the big picture, it's simply an impossible solution. We have to figure out how to retrofit these buildings. But it is a huge challenge. And I want to point out the challenge in three main aspects. One is doing it cost effectively, because it's expensive. But not only that, when we want to be net zero, it means transitioning from fossil fuels to electricity. And electricity is a lot more expensive than fossil fuels. So it's really hard to get any kind of return on investment on these kind of retrofits. So that's huge problem number one. Huge problem number two is the tenant displacement issue. We need to figure out how to do it non-invasively, because the issue with displacing tenants just makes these projects logistically just impossible. And then there's the issue of scale. Whatever we figure out how to do for an individual building, we have to make sure that it can scale, because this has to happen at an incredible scale in the city. So now, I kind of laid out, what a big challenge is, and now I want to jump into kind of what an actual solution could look like, and to kind of share, kind of what I've learned in the last 5-6 years, basically dedicated to this problem, and share what I'm working on right now as a solution. So first, when we talk about upgrading the infrastructure, what are we talking about? First, it's the facade. So again, going back to what Mo said, we need better windows, better insulation. They need to be less leaky, because that's actually the biggest problem with energy, is the cold air just leaking in. And it needs to be less maintenance intensive. It can't be all this inspections and repairing bricks. We need more durable, more cost effective to maintain options for the facade. And the other piece, again, is the HVAC. It's the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So let's start talking about the facade. There's actually a lot of progress that's already been made. And how do you upgrade the facade in a building like this? So this is a program called Energy Sprong out of Europe, where they developed this approach where they prefabricate these panels, these insulated panels, and install them like Lego pieces on the exterior of a building. And it's a way to to improve the facade, but to do it quickly, to do it cost effectively, not disrupt the tenants. It was really quite groundbreaking that they figured out how to do this. But they're doing it on, small buildings, 2, 3 story buildings, and it's a different climate in Europe where they're doing it. It's not as harsh as it is here. So, the question is, okay, can we take this and can we do it here, our buildings? And the answer is yes. So I love this example. Look at this building. This is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Looks a lot like our affordable housing buildings. And they were able to completely revitalize the exterior of this building using these prefabricated panels, to improve the energy efficiency and just make the building more beautiful. Just a true revitalization of this building from the perspective of the facade. And so they've done it there, and we can do it here too. Now the cost right now is high. That's because it's new. Any new technology, any new approach is more expensive in the beginning. As we get better at it, as we get economies of scale, the cost can come way down, and this can become much more affordable. So that's the envelope piece of it. We're heading in a good direction when it comes to the facade. Now let's talk about the HVAC. So this is an example of a recent project where NYCHA, all they did was install a heat pump system in this building. It had the old boiler system that Mo was talking about, window AC units, and they installed this more modern heat pump system to provide heating and cooling. It cost them, they didn't touch the facade, they didn't do anything else, they didn't do any ventilation or anything like that. There's just these heat pumps. It cost them $176,000 per apartment. So that's what we're talking about with this being unaffordable. This is something, if you were to install this system in a new building, it might cost $25,000 per apartment. So why did it cost $176,000 per apartment? It's because of this tenant disruption issue. And if you look at all the quotes from NYCHA, from NYPA, who supported it, that's basically what they say. They say the tenant disruption just makes this impossible. Running pipes all over the interior of the building, displacing tenants, just drives the costs way up, and it's just not a tenable approach. So we need to, this whole tenant disruption thing is really a showstopper. We need to figure out how to address it. It doesn't work for the tenants. Obviously, the tenants don't want to be disrupted, but it doesn't work for whoever, the owner operator is, because it drives up costs. It makes it more complex. It makes projects take longer. It doesn't work for anybody. So we need to figure out a better solution. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to move a little quicker, but this is an example from a project that I worked on that opened my eyes. This type of system should be easy to install, this little new wall mounted unit. But when the interior of your apartment looks like that image on the left, which most of these apartments do, it's incredibly disruptive. You have to go take down furniture, just you're like a bull in a china shop in these apartments trying to make room to install this new equipment. So we simply can't take this kind of approach. So I'm going to now share what a new approach looks like. This is a representation of an existing building. And this is how we propose is a much better way to heat these buildings. And you can think of it like wrapping the building in a heated blanket. So it's like that overclad that we saw, like that they're doing in Europe and that they did in Boston, but actually making that new facade heat up so that now you're going to heat the building from the outside in. It's much more efficient, much more comfortable. Plus, you can do it from the exterior, non-invasively. So it checks all those boxes. But what we're also doing is incorporating the cooling into that and the ventilation, so that it's really checking all the boxes. And it's all done on the exterior. It's all done non-invasively. I'm ending up taking more time than I had planned, so I'm going to skip over some of the details. But this is intended to show just a little more technically how this works. We're installing new equipment on the roof, central equipment, and we're running all the distribution down the facade. And the distribution is feeding in to this HVAC unit that's incorporated into that facade. And so that HVAC unit is delivering conditioning into the space completely from the perimeter. So this whole system is getting installed on the exterior of the building. We have to remove the existing window, but then it's all happening on the exterior. So what we're showing here is that new facade, and we're showing new central equipment up on the roof. The problem we're solving really is the distribution from that central equipment. You'll hear people talking about how great heat pumps are, how efficient they are, all these wonderful things about heat pumps. That's not the problem. The problem is, how do you get the heating and the cooling from the heat pumps to the actual units. And so that's where our distribution system comes in and running that distribution in the facade. And then developing these panels that basically plug in to that distribution. So you're installing that facade on the exterior, and you have this unit that we call the hydro box, which is delivering that heating, cooling, and ventilation into the apartment. And it's basically plugging into that distribution. You have your pipe connections on one side, your duct connection on the other side. So each of these panels plugs in to those risers that are running down the facade of the building. And then you can see that unit providing air into the space. So it's providing the ventilation air into the space. It's providing the heating and the cooling. And then we also have this essentially like a radiator that's sitting in this cavity space. That's what's creating that heated blanket effect. So you essentially end up with this warm cavity around your building, and that warmth will radiate through the uninsulated wall and create a radiant wall. So you've probably heard of like radiant floors and how wonderful and comfortable of a heating system that is. Well, this is even better. This is a radiant wall. So you're not even going to have that cold coming in the first place. Instead of feeling a cold exterior wall, you're going to have a nice, gentle warmth radiating into your building. So it's extremely comfortable. And what it also does is it actually stores heat in that masonry. That masonry has a lot of mass to it. And we're storing the heat in that masonry so that if you have a power outage, or even if it's the utilities that want to do what they call demand response, where you're going to overload the grid and they want you to cut down on your consumption for a few hours, you can just turn the system off, and that heat will just keep radiating in from that masonry. So it's actually turning that old inefficient wall into an asset for this building, because it's becoming thermal storage for the building. And then this was just to give you an idea of how the system is installed. We would install those risers from the rooftop equipment, remove the existing windows, and then using a crane in most cases, we would lift these new panels into place. And all that, that hydro box, that HVAC infrastructure is prefabricated into that panel. So now you have a relatively simple process of connecting those risers to those panels. And then you install the final panels over the risers, and that completes the installation from the exterior. There is a little bit of interior work that has to happen, because someone needs to go in. You might be removing the window from the interior, and then you actually just need to finish around that window opening. But it's very non-invasive. It'll all happen in less than a day. You just need to let the contractor in, get to the window, and then the contractor can leave. And then another thing I wanted to touch on was there's a huge push in New York to develop district thermal networks, or geothermal thermal systems, which are very similar. Because again, when you step back and stop looking at individual buildings, but look at the bigger picture of these large complexes, in many cases, the best way to heat and cool them is with super efficient central equipment that then distributes to all the buildings. And there's a law recently passed in New York State to support the development of these networks. The utilities would actually operate these networks in most cases. And so they're a huge stakeholder here as well. But the thing about these networks is you can bring this efficient heating and cooling to the building. Then again, how do you actually distribute it to the individual apartments? And so that's where our technology plugs in to essentially solve that problem, to really enable these kind of district networks to flourish in the city. Now, this is just a quick look at the benefits of doing this. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that there's going to be major reductions in energy use. Because for one, we're super insulating the building, and then we're putting a super efficient heat pump system to heat and cool it. So of course, the building energy consumption comes way down, your energy bills come way down, and the peak demand on the grid comes way down. And now, Mo mentioned costs. And that is obviously what it comes down to in many cases, is the dollars and cents. How much does this cost? And so the way I like to look at cost is look at it from what are you saving and what are you paying? That's the full economic picture. So if we start by looking at what you're saving when you do this kind of thing, and this is looking at just a stereotypical 100-bedroom, 100 unit apartment building in the city, um, how much you can save in energy costs, how much you can save in facade and HVAC maintenance costs, and how much you can save in CO2 emissions. Going back to local law 97, um, avoiding these CO2 fines. And if you actually get below your limit, actually be able to sell those credits to others. So there's actually money to be made and saved on the CO2 emissions part. So this building could see significant savings. Now let's look at the cost side of it. And I like to look at this from a financing perspective, because in most cases, these projects will be financed with loans. They're not going to be just paid out of pocket. So if you were to pay for this retrofit with a 25-year loan at 8%, here's what your annual loan payment would be. And so the key is that the loan payment is less than the savings. That really is the key. What we're saying to a building owner at this point is you can take out a loan, no money up front to do this project. And yes, you'll have to pay for that loan, but your savings are going to exceed that payment. So you have no money out of pocket and you're cash flow positive from day one. Now that is the economic picture that can really get, the owners of these buildings, the operators of these buildings on board in terms of the economics. I mean, who could turn down an economic opportunity like that? It turns this from a burden to actually a good investment. This is an investment that people will actually want to make. So that's how the economics can work here. We have to get, I mentioned when you're doing something new, the costs are always higher in the beginning. So whether or not we can achieve that kind of net zero cash flow on the first project, the answer is no, because it's going to be more expensive on the first project. But once we get to scale and we get those economies of scale, then we can absolutely achieve this net cash flow positive scenario. So that's the economic side. Of course, let's look at the tenant side, and the benefits to them as well. We're making huge improvements to their indoor air quality and their health, which, at a broader public health perspective, has huge benefits for society, for economies. It's going to be the absolute best in terms of comfort, but also acoustics. And when we talk about acoustics, the heating and cooling system is going to be very quiet, but also the acoustics from outdoors. Because when you super insulate a building, you don't just block the heat transfer, you block the noise transfer. So, the noise from, fire engines, motorcycles, kids making noise outside that disrupts people's sleep, their quality of life, we can really make a huge impact on that as well. And then, of course, doing all this with minimal tenant disruption. So the idea here is that what we're doing is we're kind of aligning the benefits. Not only do the owners and operators get huge benefit from this, but the tenants, the people living in the building, get huge benefits from this. So this whole affordable housing conversation discussing that we have now, where the two sides are kind of butting heads, which I see as being because there are no good solutions. Right now, there's only bad solutions. And when you only have bad solutions, somebody's going to get screwed. And so you fight over who's going to get screwed. And to Luana's point, it's the people who don't have the political voice who are going to get screwed. But what I want you to imagine is a different scenario where we can actually have solutions that are good for the owner operators and good for the tenants. And imagine once they're aligned and they both want to see this happen and they're both on the same side pushing this forward, just imagine what an impact that could have on the city and, to the benefit of all of us. Now, I just want to finish by saying this all sounds great. This was, a PowerPoint presentation, but is this real? I can show people images and, spreadsheets and calculations all day long, but, are we really going to be able to do this? And so, I'm excited to share with you guys that we just recently, just a few months ago, actually received a grant from Enterprise Community Partners and Wells Fargo to actually do our first pilot project with this technology. So this is with the Syracuse Housing Authority in Syracuse. It's a 7-story building built in 1954 that's really exactly like, all of these buildings we have in New York City. And we have an amazing team together to do this pilot project. And we expect construction to begin next year, and hopefully will be completed about 2 years from now, so early 2026. And that's going to be the proof. We're going to prove it with this project. And once we do, there's going to be huge opportunities then to bring this into New York City and to help solve a lot of the problems that we're facing that, that we were discussing today. So we're really excited about it. And I'll stop there. Really looking forward to any questions and just to any discussion.
David, that was excellent, a really excellent presentation. And this is going on in Europe too. It's there's proof there, right?
Right. So they're doing the facade part of it. So this whole overcladding concept from the exterior they are doing. But this approach with integrating HVAC into the facade as well, that's something that's new. And they're not doing yet in Europe. But
Yeah.
we hope to spread it there as well.
Well, you're talking very your whole presentation speaks to humanity, and I appreciate that when you talk about doing what's right and keeping this displacement down, that sort of thing, and saving money. But now we have to kind of take this and push this idea to the powers to be. And Susan has a question in Luana. Susan.
Sure, thank you. Have you been in any discussions with NYCHA at all about this?
So that's a great question. I mean, this whole thing started with NYCHA in mind. It all started when I worked on my first NYCHA project and was like, wow, we need new solutions to this problem. But my experience so far has been that it's been hard to get through to NYCHA. And I think part of that is, as I was saying at the end, as long as it's all fancy graphics and calculations, it's hard to get their attention. I think that once we prove it on that project in Syracuse, that I think it'll be a lot easier to get their attention on it. But that being said, like I said, I'm a technical person. I'm an engineer. I don't necessarily know the best ways to get through to NYCHA. But with a group like this, if you have any suggestions on how better to reach them and get their support in this effort, then I would love to, talk about that and learn about that.
Is this being done in Ravenswood?
So that's an interesting question, because there was a proposal to do something sort of similar to this. So again, to do the overclad, not to do the HVAC the way we're doing it, but to do the overclad in a similar way. And then they had a whole more traditional kind of approach for the HVAC system. And what happened with that project in Ravenswood is that all the bids came in from contractors way too high, and so the project didn't go forward. And there's a few lessons to take away from that. And actually, the architect on the Ravenswood project is part of our team for this project that we're going to be doing in Syracuse. One of the takeaways was just that they needed a better approach on the HVAC side of things. The HVAC, the way they were doing it, was making it too expensive and too invasive. But the other piece of the approach is that the way we procure these projects cannot be the traditional way of having a design team put together a package and then just going and bidding it out to contractors who know nothing about the project, because then the bids come in way too high. So the approach that we're going to take on the Syracuse project is to do what's called design build and have the contractor part of the team from the very beginning. So we're developing the drawings, developing the design with the contractor, so that we're not just going out to random contractors later to get a price, but we're getting a fixed price from that contractor in the beginning. So we believe that that's how these projects need to be procured going forward.
So would you also say that's a general problem with how NYCHA does its work?
It seems to me that it is, but it's also something that NYCHA recognizes. So they have some modernization programs active right now, and they are starting to do design build on those programs. So I think they've recognized as well that the traditional procurement is not really working for this type of project, and so they are transitioning to that approach.
Just to chime in on this part of the discussion, the presentation was so interesting. I end up staying for a little longer. Having being exposed to the other side, the owner's requirements and dealing with the projects a little bit in the last 10 years, I can tell you that really the issue is all for the contractor, and procuring such a project is about for the construction people to understand what's the risk involved. And in any project, that the level of risk for the unknown can kill the project. And it is paramount to make sure that the builder or the construction team is really comfortable with the solution in order to reduce the risk on their part, in order to reduce the cost of the construction. The insurance for the project, the risk factor for the project, these are things that basically constitute somewhere about 30% of the cost of a project. So it's you can imagine how things basically can get out of the control very easily for the construction that is in the classical conventional method. So I think that David's spot on as far as looking at these projects totally differently from the get-go as a private and public partnership.
Yeah, and just to add 2 points to that, that's another benefit of staying outside of the building, is you reduce so much of the risk of not knowing what you're going to find when you actually get into the building. You know, you can see from the outside, you know, what's there. So it's not like going inside and not knowing what you're going to find behind a wall when you open a wall, things like asbestos, things like that. So you eliminate a lot of that risk. And by the way, you know, when we talk about tenant disruption, contractors don't like that either. You know, contractors don't like the idea of going into tenants' apartments and doing major work and fighting with the tenants. And so when they see that, you know, they multiply their bid by, you know, twice or triple, you know, because honestly, they don't even want that work because it's a nightmare for them as well. So to just add on to that point.
Rob?
Just quickly, thank you, David, for the presentation. That was very informative. People have made mention of a political struggle. I don't think you can avoid that when you get involved in public housing in New York City, right? We have, you know, maybe 400,000 people living in public housing. So it's a city, right? And you just mentioned displacement. We've seen the federal government fail in the past with Hope 6, trying to rebuild a community. I look at Liberty City in Miami, which was a Hope 6 project, moving people out, promising one-for-one replacement, and it never worked out. I do think, though, you have an opportunity to get in front of HUD. You know, HUD funds public housing and funds NYCHA. And HUD is pushing, the federal government is pushing at NYCHA right now for control. So there's a little bit of an open door. And as I like to say, when you have your foot in the door, you kick it open and you bring in your information. So I do think there's an opportunity right now to get in front of HUD on a federal level and talk about this issue, and at the very least, plant a seed to sort of challenge NYCHA. So that's just my way.
You went to mute.
I'm sorry. As an activist, when I don't live in public housing, I support people living in public housing, but I've had to deal with NYCHA and HUD through something called the continuum of care. And I always found that when I brought the point of view from DC to New York, the HUD director was always fearful of me. It's like, how do you have information from Washington that I don't have? Well, you know, I know who really funds you. So I'm going above your head to find out information. So, you know, I know there's protocols and all of that, but it's just something for you to think about. I think you have a small window of opportunity right now because of the struggle between the federal government and NYCHA. So it might be an opportunity that can be taken advantage of at this very time.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's a good opportunity, I believe. I think, Susan, that's your second hand. Luana, is that?
Yeah, no, Susan, she might want to say something else.
Okay, Susan?
I'll be hi, thanks. I'll be real fast. I just wanted to kind of alert you that there is pushback on design build because it's something the city has been pushing down our throats, and does not allow for guarantees on community input. So just wanted to let you know that.
I didn't
David,
understand.
you want to respond?
No, I didn't understand
yeah.
what you said. Yeah.
Oh, Susan, you want
Well,
to break?
David was talking about saving money through design build, which is, true. You do save money that way and time. But this is something the city has been pushing down our throats. I think the first time was at Borough-based jail. And so, and it does not allow for guarantees to the community, what they will see or whether their input will be able to be taken. So I just wanted to alert you that there are issues with it to deal with.
Yes, thank you for that input. And it actually brings up one thing that I didn't mention that's important for the Syracuse pilot. A huge amount of effort is going to be put into community engagement. So that's a huge piece of this. And, specifically a chunk of the funding was put into that. So, not only are we piloting the technology, but we're piloting the whole process. And there's going to be, we're going to assign a community liaison that, from the building that we're going to pay. And we're going to have lots of meetings to get input from the community on, what they actually want to see. So anyway, I just wanted to emphasize, because I didn't mention it in the presentation,
If
that
I
community
could-
engagement will be a huge focus.
If I can say that checks a box, but when you have design build, and what does it mean for the community engagement? The community
Right.
engages, and then they say, this is what I want, but there's no guarantees with design build.
Right. Understood. Yeah, good point.
I'm not quite grasping that. If you're coming together on any project and you involve the community, what's different about this project than a standard build? I know you got separate entities and you're dissecting the different.
Because there's no guarantee on the design. The design is going to be decided as you build it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a point just to design build in general, like no matter what approach you're taking, no matter what you're using, just in general, if you're doing design build, you might be locked into a budget from the start, and then community might want something, but if you're already locked into a budget, maybe you can't give them what they want. So that, that's definitely something we'll want to, as we go through the process in Syracuse, figure out how to make that as effective as possible. Like for example, for the pilot, we're going to have a pot of money set aside for a community amenity, and we'll get input from the community what they actually want that to be. Do they want it to be like a little community garden out front? Do they want it to be like a nice furnished picnic area? Or I'm just throwing off random things, but so hopefully we'll start to try to figure out some ways to address some of that.
So those amenities would probably not be impacted, but they're pretty small amenities.
Right.
If the amenity that they wanted was a community room and you're doing design build, you might be into the building and say, this just won't fit in with where we're at now. Sorry to be a downer.
Well, it's not unusual. I just want to, I'm glad to see you, Robert. I just want to say, I'm glad you're back to your lively self, coming through all that you've been through and using I'm glad your wisdom is here. Thank you, David, for that presentation. I mean, that is the most hope I've heard since this fight has begun. And I want to say that the project is bigger than, the issues are bigger than what they appear. Thank you, Robert, for some solution in this window, because we really need this help. I think a lot of and I don't want to step on any toes, our community board, our elected officials, they're all, against us, the demolition for the demolition of these buildings. And I don't, the lives involved, I get so these are people's lives. This is not about a building only. It's about lives. It's about homes. It's about families. It's about community. And it's about what you're trying to change it into. It's so much deeper than just about the building. right? So I know we have our politics and our laws and stuff like that. I am on the board at Penn South. I mow, you were talking 7th Avenue, but we're on 8th Avenue. And we have been dealing with the local laws and the changes that we have in our own infrastructure that's old. So I'm very much aware of the things that are going on in terms of the buildings and the upgrades they want us to do now. All of a sudden, everything has to be done at one point. But I think your solution, you know, Robert, you mentioned Liberty City, we have Chicago, we have Los Angeles, we have so many different places that this has happened to. And those people have never returned to their homes, period.
Yeah.
And this area is gentrified to the max. And we have these big, tall skyscrapers, these big real estate developers who are getting money in people's pockets, and they are making the moves. And the little people, we're not little, we're a lot if we get together and stick together, can make a difference. But it's a big fight. But I thank you, David, because you made such a profound presentation in reference to some hope. So I just wanted to thank you. I get emotional because these are lives.
Yeah.
This is
No,
not a joke. This is not a policy on paper.
Yeah.
This is real.
A lot of passion there, and we're with you. Speaking of politicians and political parties and so forth, am I saying your name right? Naisha? Naisha? Is that Naisha Diaz? Are you still here with us?
She said Naisha in the beginning.
Naisha, okay. Thanks, Alex.
Sorry, it's actually Naisha.
Naisha. Okay.
Sorry, I was having trouble reading.
Any thoughts from you and your end? Would you? I imagine you're going to take this to your boss, but any instead of the traditional way, have you guys even looked into any other alternatives? Are you putting in input on what's going on here on the ground?
So I personally I'm not part of the housing team. That's more in their world. What I'm doing here is listening to what the concerns that you will have and reporting back to the governor with the budget coming up. She's like really interested in knowing what's happening on the ground, the suggestions of the community, and seeing where you all stand. So I'm serving as that person for her, kind of reporting back, discussing with her what the concerns are. So after this, on Thursday, I will have a memo for her about this meeting that will outline what you all talked about, concerns, asks, flags, and our housing team, the governor, and our budget teams, and our legislative teams will take it from there.
Wonderful. If you need a copy of the tape, I seem to have some technical difficulties for some reason, but we have this recorded, so
Great.
Let me know. Okay.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you.
All right. We're yeah.
I hate to interrupt, but I'm glad Naisha's here. The governor called our area blighted, remember, and she wanted to demolish a whole block of people and displace 2,000 some odd people and businesses. So I just want her to know that we are very much alive and well over here in Chelsea. Thank you. David, was there a cost benefit analysis as to the demolition versus the shell, the hydraulic shell?
Well, so Mo mentioned some numbers. He said about $600 a square foot to demolish and rebuild. And then he said when they were looking at retrofit solutions, they were looking at roughly $300 a square foot to do those. Right now, our cost projections, so like I mentioned, it's a little tricky because it's going to be more expensive at first, but then once we get to scale, the cost will come down. The cost right now, like for our first project, it's probably going to be roughly $150 per square foot for the retrofit. So still considerably less than the number Mark gave with current solutions. But we can project that once we reach economies of scale, it'll be well under 100 per square foot. And hope is to get it into the 50 to 60 per square foot range is our target.
Thanks, David. Yeah, that's one of the first things Mo and I talked about. And I thought, well, we gotta look at what you're doing, and boy, it's very pleasing to see what you're doing. We've talked about it, and to see it laid out like this, thank you. We got to move on real soon here. I hate to, but we do have Alex hands up.
Oh, mine's fast. Trust me. David, I wanted to know if you heard feedback from the Boston tenants. Like, did they have lower bills and such practical things, or do you know?
That is a great question. I actually haven't heard anything. That project was completed. Actually, I have to go back to my slide. I can't remember. I think late 2022. So I think it's been in operation for about a year now. I'm not aware of any kind of public information that's been shared in terms of feedback. But, I'd certainly be interested if it were available. I can tell you for our pilot in Syracuse, that's going to be a huge portion of it is monitoring and measuring, doing, tenant surveys after getting their feedback and making all that public.